Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from Hebrew College's Shulman Graduate School of Jewish Education. In their master's degree program, learn to engage diverse Jewish communities and develop expertise to address pressing contemporary issues. The program can be completed online from anywhere in the world or on campus just outside of Boston. Generous scholarships are available. Learn more and reflect back on Passover by downloading the article The Four Neurodivergent Children by Rachel Figura-Smith at www.hebrewcollege.edu/unbound. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 170, Queering the Jewish Bookshelf. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And we have reached the midpoint of our Omer exploration. This is week 4 of 7 weeks in which we are trying to present a variety of ideas and sources that are not the typical ones that people are always thinking about. A lot of what we've talked about up till now and what we'll talk about going forward does not have to do with the classic notion of people of the book, so about texts, but this week actually is about texts, but in a really interesting new way. Our guest today is Noam Sienna. He is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota studying Jewish history and museum studies. While not working on his PhD dissertation, he had time to put together a quite thick book called A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969. The book is an unprecedented collection of 120 texts that cover various aspects of the queer Jewish experience from ancient times to much more recent times. As the book jacket states, spanning 2 millennia, 5 continents, and containing translations from 15 different languages, A Rainbow Thread is the new definitive anthology for queer Jewish history. We thought it was a great book with so many interesting texts that we're excited to dive into. Before we do, just a little bit more biographical information about Noam Sienna. The dissertation that he's working on when he's not putting together thick books of queer Jewish texts is focused on Jewish book culture in North Africa in the 18th and 19th century. He's also interested in medieval Jewish illumination, the Cairo Geniza, Jewish magic and demonology, Jewish henna practices, and the history of Judaica. Noam is also a practicing calligrapher, illuminator, and sofer, whose work is mostly inspired by medieval Jewish art. We can't wait to dive into this book, so Noam Sienna, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so terrific to have you on.
Thank you.
Well, we're so excited about the collection of texts that you've put out recently. I actually wanted to start in a somewhat unusual way, which is to actually jump into one of the texts right away, because I think that it's particularly relevant to our discussion for today and topics that we've been discussing for the 3 years or so that this podcast has been going on. And it's the text that was written by a man who had immigrated to America about a story from his shtetl. From his small village somewhere in Eastern Europe. And he wrote this letter, I imagine initially in Yiddish, to the Yiddish Daily Forward newspaper. And it's a story about an individual from his shtetl who was read and understood to be a woman, who at a certain point left the shtetl and returned, now being read and understood by everybody in the shtetl to be now a man. Mm-hmm. And what was remarkable to me about this story is a few things. You know, number one, it sort of breaks what I think a lot of people sort of imagine is that somehow all of these new realities of people in our community who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, etc. This is some kind of new phenomenon. Sure, maybe there were some people, but nobody really talked about it. And here, this letter is kind of so it's not, I wouldn't say it's casual, but it's just sort of telling a story that not only did this happen, but this individual is accepted by the entire community now as a man. So that was number one that I thought was so interesting. But number two was that there included in the story is that I don't remember if it's the person themselves or maybe the parents who spoke to a Hasidic Rebbe.
Yeah.
To get help with this situation before the transition. And what struck me was that the Rebbe just kind of wanted to make it happen. The Rebbe was helpful. You sort of think, again, stereotypically of the leadership of the Jewish community as always being condemnatory about queerness. And yet there seemed to be a sense here that the Rebbe actually wanted to be of help. And that was fascinating to me. And it led to the third piece, which is that your book is a collection of texts, But this particular story is only incidentally a text because somebody wrote a letter about it. Had this person not written this letter to make it possible for you to find it, this story would have been completely unknown, like probably many other stories that, for whatever set of reasons, they weren't happening in the realm where they would get translated into text. And this is sort of the exception that proves the rule. And for that reason, sort of all of this all put together felt to me like a sort of fascinating initial piece to start to explore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that you're absolutely right that in many ways, so many of the stories included in this collection, that they happen to be recorded and that they show that, in fact, many, many more stories like this existed that weren't recorded, and that these are exceptional circumstances that, for the most part, were recorded by people outside of the particular event, right? Like, we don't have this event recorded from the perspective of Beryl is the fellow's name who actually transitions. Beryl doesn't write down their own memoir, their experience of transition. And so we can only see it from the outside. We have several lenses actually on top of each other that distance us from the actual experience. And even with all those lenses, we're still able to recognize something about this story as speaking to or somehow corresponding to some experience that we might be familiar with today. But absolutely, we need to constantly remind ourselves that what we know of Jewish history is only accidental. It's only the small subset of experiences that were recorded, that the recordings were made accessible, that we've read and incorporated those texts into our understanding of Jewish history. It's completely non-representative as a sampling of what Jewish life, what Jewish experience has been over the course of history. And that's a point I should acknowledge. That's a point that is not original to me. I'm not the first person to notice this. Feminist scholars have been saying this for decades, that if we take Jewish text to be equivalent to Judaism, then almost the entirety of Jewish women's experience is not Jewish. Since at least 30, 40 years now, feminist scholars have been saying we need to reevaluate and rethink what we mean when we talk about Jewish history, what kinds of sources we look to when we look towards Jewish history, and recover alternate ways of knowing about Judaism. And that points to, if I can bring another text, if I can jump to another text, one of the very last texts of the book is the very first responsum written by an American rabbi about homosexuality, or a rabbinic legal response to a question that's asked of a rabbinic authority. So someone says to the rabbi, what should we do about, in this case, homosexuality? And the rabbi offers their response, which becomes a kind of legal precedent. And in this case, the question is about having a program about homosexuality in Judaism in 1969, which is pretty amazing. It's pretty extraordinary that already in 1969, and I don't know, it's not dated to the month, so I don't know whether it was before or after the events of the summer of 1969, sometimes called the Stonewall riots or the Stonewall uprising in New York, which catalyzed a new sense of activism, a new visibility to the struggle for gay rights, as it was called in those days. I like to imagine that after that event, there was a synagogue, this synagogue is in Florida, that was motivated to have a program about homosexuality. In any case, they asked this rabbi, named Rabbi Freehoff, what should we do in this program? What is there in Judaism on the subject? What does Judaism say about homosexuality? And Rabbi Freehoff looks at his bookshelf, as it were. He says, when I look at the extent of Jewish text that I know, he says, it is remarkable. The paucity of sources dealing with this topic is remarkable. In other words, when I look at my bookshelf, Rabbi Freehoff says, I don't see anything that deals with homosexuality. There's one small, Maimonides has one sentence about it. The Talmud has one sentence about it. But there's really not any extended discussion of it. And there's certainly no extended personal experiences that are on my bookshelf. And so I feel comfortable saying, and he says, this testifies well to the normalcy and purity of the Jewish people. Homosexuals are impure and abnormal, and they don't exist in Jewish history. But I think the mistake that Rabbi Friehoff is making, which is a mistake that many people fall into, is to look at what happens to be on his bookshelf and say, aha, this bookshelf represents everything that has ever existed in Judaism. I have the classical codes of rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud. I have the medieval compilations of Jewish law, Maimonides, etc. I have a few early modern, 18th, 19th century compilations of Jewish law, all written by men, mostly written in Europe. And that's it. That's everything I need to know about Judaism. If it's not on this shelf, it doesn't exist. And this is a sliver. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is the 1%, so to speak, of Jewish experience. And as soon as we move the spotlight over a little bit to look at experiences outside that narrow framework, we see an entirely different picture of Judaism. And that's only looking at text. My project, this anthology, is actually still restricting itself to text. I'm not looking at music. I'm not looking at art, even just restricting myself to texts that were written, mostly published, some unpublished. The picture has completely shifted, that all of a sudden the population, the demographics of the people who populate Jewish history has been radically transformed. It's a completely different population of people than the people who lived on Rabbi Friehoff's bookshelf.
And I want to go back to the story of that other Rebbe, that Hasidic Rebbe, and just contrast him to Rabbi Friehoff in the following sense. I remember this struck me so much at the time, and it continues to live in my mind, that Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who is known as the first openly gay Orthodox rabbi, in the bonus features of the documentary Trembling Before God, there's an interview with Steve Greenberg where he's telling the story about how rabbis were supposed to operate, which is like if you came to the rabbi and you said, is this chicken kosher? The rabbi wasn't supposed to look in a book and say it's kosher or not kosher. The rabbi was supposed to say, tell me about you. Are you poor? Are you rich? Because if you're poor, you need it to be kosher more, et cetera, et cetera. And that there's this tradition of being a rabbi and also a tradition of how Judaism works that's not just about looking things up in a book. Now, I've heard it said, and I don't know if this comes from scholarship or just, what smart people say, but there's a lot of people talk about how after the destruction of the Holocaust, there had to be kind of a rebuilding of Judaism in many ways. And Judaism post-Holocaust became much more text-centric than it used to be. And that there was this tradition of a very sensitive understanding of who people were, and that was the role of the rabbi and certainly the Rebbe in the Hasidic world. And in a way, I guess what I'm curious about is whether in exploring this world of text, and as you say, of what's not written as text, it also sort of helps us surface the notion that it's more than just that certain people have been excluded from the Jewish story because their work wasn't put out in text. That's true. And it's also true that a certain way of being a Jewish leader was kind of forgotten and excluded from the text because it's exactly the non-text oral tradition in a way that has always ridden alongside the text. But when you kill a lot of people, you kill a lot of the oral tradition, and actually a huge piece of Judaism has been lost. And in some way, what this is surfacing is the need, ironically, what your textual project is surfacing is also the need to sort of find a way to revivify this non-textual part of Jewish leadership.
I want to also emphasize, and you're right, this is really a remarkable source, this Yiddish letter. And what the writer testifies to is that when Beryl comes back, Beryl leaves this shtetl and goes off to Odessa. And when they come back from Odessa, he says, half the shtetl ran to the bridge to greet her, or better said, to greet him. And then as soon as he comes back into the shtetl, they teach him how to daven, they teach him how to pray. Being raised as a woman, he would not have been taught to lead a service, to read from the prayer book. All of this has to be taught. He's married to a woman in the shtetl. In other words, completely integrated into the life of the shtetl.
And truly accepting him as a man.
And completely, and unquestioning. There's no, there's no hesitation. They don't go to the Rebbe and say, what side of the mechitza should he sit on? What are we going to do? The barrier between men and women in the traditional synagogue. Should he marry a woman? They don't even think to ask the question, at least as far as this particular reporter is reporting the story. We don't know the whole truth of it. But as far as this person remembers, it was immediately obvious to all of the inhabitants of this small village how this person should be reintegrated into their community. And what's important about that is I think we sometimes unconsciously have inherited this image, particularly of the shtetl, the village, the Jewish life in Europe before the Holocaust in the past, as a kind of frozen, fossilized, Fiddler on the Roof style traditionalism. And what this story shows is that's completely not the case. And this notion that we have that history automatically moves in a certain direction, right? That societies naturally, inherently become more progressive over time, that we are obviously more tolerant, more accepting, and more diverse than our ancestors, even our immediate, our grandparents or our great-grandparents. That's an assumption that is completely unwarranted. In different times and places, how to understand sexuality or gender have been completely different. And of course, we're just talking about sexuality and gender. We could have the same exact conversation about any other area of Jewish life, but that there's not any kind of what historians sometimes call teleology, right? There's no arc of history that moves in an automatic direction. I was listening to, I won't name any names, but I was listening to another podcast the other day. Someone was talking about their own family in New York and going to the Schwitz, going to a sauna with their grandfather and reminiscing about sort of that generation of Jewish immigrants to New York and their experiences. And then they tell the story that one day they went to the sauna with their grandfather and after their grandfather had died, they went back to the sauna and with their son, and they walked in and they saw two men having sex. And then they said out loud, well, I bet my grandfather never saw anything like that. And I thought to myself, that's wrong. That's totally wrong. Like the reasoning behind that assumption, I understand it, but it's completely wrong. There's no basis to assume that someone of the 1920s in New York on the Lower East Side would not have seen men having sex. In fact, we know from all kinds of records, some of which are in this book, that it's more than possible. It's likely that an Eastern European Jewish immigrant on the Lower East Side would have been very familiar with the idea of men having sex with each other. He certainly may not have known the word homosexual or gay. He may not have had any words for it. But the phenomenon that two men might have sex or two women might be having relations with each other, totally a situation which is not new and which is not unique to our experiences in contemporary America.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's so important to establish. And I'm just going to underline and emphasize and probably put in our show notes on the website something about the word teleology that you brought up. But absolutely, this idea that, history flows naturally from some ancient backwards place to some glorified, new, wonderful place is very deeply entrenched in our minds. And it takes some unlearning because you're right, it is wrong. It's just wrong. But so I want to ask about a few things that have come up, because what I've gleaned in looking at your book is that, so this book is about queerness, like in a sense. Like this book does talk. This book obviously, like it features all sorts of texts that have been ignored for all the reasons you're talking about, and elevates them so that this book, when it is on people's bookshelves, changes how we think of that Jewish bookshelf. So that's clear. But it's also about how we tell Jewish history. We could zoom out for a second and think more expansively about how we do Jewish history and then apply it to all sorts of different zones. And so I want to actually jump to something that you wrote that was, it was one of those like standing ovations sitting at my computer reading moments. It was like, this is so right. But in your intro, you said the following: I'd like to note that this book is not a guide to Jewish law. It may not solve Jewish legal and ritual issues, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to cure your homophobic or transphobic rabbi, teacher, boss, grandparent. These are all, by the way, I think real reasons that somebody might look to a book like this. So I think it's so valuable that you name what you're doing and what you're not doing. But here we really get juicy. This book is also not an attempt to show that Judaism, quote, really promotes queer inclusion, or to argue that central Jewish texts might be interpreted to that end. I was on Facebook recently, and there was a fascinating conversation going on in a Jewish Facebook group about Anne Frank, and about whether Anne Frank was really bisexual or what we should call Anne Frank. Should we call Anne Frank anything? Are these labels anachronistic? And I wanted to ask about that word anachronistic, because you use it in this paragraph later. And it seems to loom large in your book, because the easy conclusion we could jump to is like, yes, queer people as we think of them in 2019, we now know that they've been around for thousands of years in the same sense, and we just didn't discover them yet. And I know that's not what you're saying, and I want to really understand why you're not saying that, because it seems like to many folks that might be a great message to be like, yes, there is ancient precedent for this. That should make us more accepting now. But why is it important for us to really add nuance and think both about what is present in history and how it might look different from how we understand the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q today?
I think that's such an important question. It's something that was present for me all throughout working on this book. I really resonate. I don't want to dismiss too quickly the emotional connection that people have to seeing themselves in history. It's hugely important. And so I don't want to sound like I'm poo-pooing the thrill and the comfort and the relief that if someone today who, let's say, identifies as a gay man, looks at some of the texts in this book and says, wow, as a gay man, I see myself in Jewish history now because of these texts. What I hope they won't say, but I know that people might, is to then say, oh, Yehuda Halevi, one of the medieval poets included in this book, was a gay man. He wrote poetry that articulates romantic or erotic desire for another man. And I'm a gay man, and I feel erotic desire for other men. So Yehuda Halevi was also a gay man. The reason why I don't think that's helpful is because it blocks us from seeing precisely what the contours of identity or experience meant in the time and place that we're looking at. If we apply our framework and our understanding as a one-to-one frame on the past, it makes it actually more difficult for us to appreciate how the past might be different. You can go too far in the other direction, which is to say, because everything's relative and the past is a different place and they thought about gender in a different way and they thought about sexuality in a different way, people often mobilize that to block identification, to say, you can't claim that there's any kind of queer history because the entire project is anachronistic. Above all, why it is not helpful to make the big list of, who's who of gay Jews or trans Jews or lesbian Jews, which is a project that some people tried to do. And it was one of the first tactics, actually, of early gay activists, even into the 19th century, that people would say, well, Michelangelo was gay, and Leonardo da Vinci was gay, and King James, was gay, and so on and so forth, and therefore we have a place in history. But the reason why I ultimately think that's not helpful is because in the 19th century, people made lists to say, here are all of the famous Uranists and inverts of the past, because that was the terminology they were using in that time. They understood themselves to be inverts, let's say. And then in the 1950s, people said, here are all of the gay and lesbian people of the past. In the 90s, people said, here are all the trans people in the past. And now In the last 5 years, people have been working on lists of all of the famous non-binary and genderqueer and pansexual people. Right? In other words, the goalposts are constantly moving. And so if the same people in the past, in the 1890s were inverts, and in the 1950s were homosexuals, and in the 1990s were pan and queer and bi, then maybe what we should stop to reflect on is the fact that the historical data aren't changing for the most part. What's changing is our lenses. Our understandings of ourselves are constantly shifting. What we're doing is constantly trying to find those moments in the past that spark some kind of connection with the present. What I'm hoping for is an awareness, right? A kind of meta awareness of the process itself, to acknowledge that what we're not doing is finding gay people in the past. What we're doing is, as queer people, gay people, lesbian people, trans people today, we're finding connections from ourselves to the past.
I think that there's a defensive element of this, right? Because it's not just, so there is that people want to feel that they are representative of the past. It creates a sense that, maybe the term would be, I feel Jewishly authentic because there's an ancient version of me that I can see in this text that, that means that what I'm doing isn't new, and if it were new, somehow that would make it less okay. But there's this defensive thing where I think in the back of people's minds is always the homophobic grandparent or friend or rabbi or whatever that you mentioned also in your introduction, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to think from that person's mindset. How would I get that person to see legitimacy in who I am? And they're saying, if I can find something 3,000 or 2,000 or 1,000 or 500 years old that looks like me, if I can find something, then that sort of wins on their turf. And that's a good thing to do. So if I can say, you're using this line, it's not Adam and Eve, it's Adam and Steve. If I can look to some stuff that says, actually Adam and Eve were androgynous, I win a debate with these people, and they're flummoxed. But the reality is, or at least my understanding of reality is, for lack of a better phrase, homophobe's going to homophobe sometimes. And I don't know that people really are thinking intellectually about what's present in the past and deciding that's how they think now. I mean, sure, to some extent that's at play, but ultimately they'll find other ways. So the defensive piece of this can't be overstated. And what that makes me to reflect back what I love about this book, it's not defensive. It's not from this place of, we're surrounded by Jews that think we're illegitimate. We're surrounded by a society that thinks we're legitimate. We need to prove it. And I've read books, including books that have been very formative for me. Twice Blessed, which you cited in your book, my uncle wrote an essay in, and it's been very, very important for me. But it is a more defensive place in the 1980s, talking in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. Can you talk more about why it's so important not to just be defensive, but actually to make the active, positive claims about queerness that you are doing?
Again, this is hugely important, and it's something that really was with me from the beginning of the project. I didn't want this to be an apology, an apologetic attempt to always be on the defensive, exactly as you said. And again, I want to repeat something I said earlier, which is that this goes back to debates that Jewish feminists have been having for decades about Jewish women's history and about the place of women in Judaism, right? And is Judaism really authentically feminist, or maybe proto-feminist, right? Is the Torah really a proto-feminist document, or is the Torah really inherently misogynistic, inherently patriarchal, and therefore we have to scrap the whole project? I should acknowledge that my mother is a feminist theologian, is a scholar and a feminist writer on Jewish topics, and she wrote one of these very early studies in the early 90s about feminist Judaism and rereading the Torah. What I understood from her is it's both and it's neither, right? The Torah, and by extension we could say Jewish history, contains so many multitudes of experiences and texts that if we're honest, if we are intellectually honest about the material that we have, we have to acknowledge that it includes parts that can be read in service of patriarchy and in service of misogyny, and it includes parts that can be read in service of equality and egalitarianism and feminism. And the same is true for sexuality and for gender. Some people have asked me, well, why didn't you just pick the good stuff? Why didn't you just pick the sources and texts that were affirming and supportive and that can be corralled to be delivered as proof to that rabbi or school director or parent or whatever, to say, look, you really do need to change your policy, or you do need to really, adopt this particular stance. I think some of the material in this book could be used that way. I've had conversations, for example, with Steve Greenberg about, he's been working for years now on preparing curriculum support and on working with Jewish schools and Jewish educators. And I said, I would love for you to use this book as a resource, but I'll be honest with you that I don't think the book as it is will necessarily do what you might want it to do.
What was fascinating to me were these two contradictory sources that are from the Talmud. One is this statement that Jewish men are not suspected of homosexuality, and therefore it's fine for one Jewish man to be in a room alone together with another Jewish man because there's no reason to suspect that they might engage in homosexual behavior, unlike the rule of not having a man and a woman in a room together because, obviously that they're highly suspected of that. But at the same time, there's this story in the Talmud that you have in the collection about a rabbi who goes up onto the roof of the study hall, maybe to have a smoke, and he finds that there are two men having sex, two of the students, and they basically say to him, there's nothing you can do about it because Jewish law requires having two witnesses in order to convict somebody of something, and you're only one witness. And so first of all, that story itself suggests that often most of the time, people try to have sex by themselves in private. So there would be a good reason why you wouldn't have a lot of legal rulings since Jewish law requires there to be two witnesses. But on the other hand, despite all that and all the machinations that we can make, there's also this strange statement that the Jews are not suspected of engaging in homosexual activity, in contrast to other nations around them, whether that might be the Greeks or whoever. And that's just the question that I guess I have is, first of all, are they just being naive? Do they have some other agenda that, why are they making that statement? Do they truly believe it, or is there something sort of going on in terms of why they kind of want to make that statement or set things up that way? And then, but then also, how can they say things like that when in the same book there's this other story?
Yeah, it's a great observation. And I think it points us right back to what we were talking about before, which is that, the past is complex and contains multitudes. And certainly the Talmud is one of the best examples of that. There is no one Talmudic voice. There is no one Talmudic answer to anything. And I think it also points to complexities of understanding sexuality in the past. And when we try and understand how, especially as you move farther and farther back in the past, so now we're talking about, almost 2,000 years ago, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, we run into these blocks because of assumptions that we might have, even unconscious assumptions that we might have about sexuality. Like, one thing is that we have this idea of something called homosexuality that is, an identity that is inherent, that is total, and that separates certain kinds of people from other kinds of people. There are homosexual people, and then there are non-homosexual people. And that's an idea that once it exists in our brains, it's difficult to think without it. But I think it's really necessary to try, because that's certainly not, and maybe I'll out myself here, as it were, as someone who understands sexuality and gender to be socially constructed identities. There are people who maintain what you might call essentialist positions. That is, there's something essential about human sexuality that does not change over time. But I would argue that when you look at the past, you're not looking at a context where there are some people who are homosexual people, who are men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women, and then everyone else doesn't do that. when you have, for example, this very strange story of this rabbi who goes up to the roof of the house of study, the Beit HaMidrash, and he sees these two men. Now, it's not clear exactly what they're doing. The language is euphemistic. It says they're engaging with each other. It's clearly some kind of sexual activity. It's not clear exactly what they're doing. They might be cuddling. They might be kissing. They might be having oral sex. They might be having anal sex. I mean, just to be explicit, I don't know what they're doing. It's, by the way, this is the shortest text that is included in the anthology. It's just 2 sentences, but I felt like I had to include it because it is the only place in the entire body of Talmudic literature where there's an actual instance of homosexual activity being described that actually happened, that was witnessed. It's not theoretical. It's not, we do not suspect Jews of homosexual activity because we're thinking about it. This is an actual instance that we know that people were having. So that's really interesting to me. To put it against these other ideas, like that we don't suspect Jews of homosexual activity. So this might point us towards stereotypes about sexuality that Jews had about themselves versus other nations that may or may not have been based in actual demographic behavior, but certainly every nation and culture has ideas about themselves vis-a-vis sexuality versus other nations, for sure. Different places blame it on other places. So in French, they would call it le goût italien, the Italian taste, having the Italian taste. But the Italians blame it on the English, and the English blame it on the Arabs, and the Arabs blame it on the, right? In other words, every nation kind of points the finger at the other nation to say, you're the ones who really gave us the idea. And it also might be the rabbis turning a blind eye to say, we're not really concerned about this behavior because it's not socially disruptive. And more, and I think this is something, again, that in general, Jewish scholars in the last decade have been writing about and have been arguing. When we start looking at other kinds of sources, like archaeological sources, for example, what we discover is Jews living in the time of the Talmud did not all live the way that the Talmud describes them living. In the Middle Ages, also, the Cairo Geniza, which is something I've done a lot of work on, what we've discovered and what scholars of the Cairo Geniza of the last decade or so have written about is Jews of the medieval world did all kinds of things that were either not described by or explicitly forbidden by medieval rabbinic law. Now we have to rethink our whole picture of Jewish life in the Middle Ages. What we thought we were looking at when we looked at medieval Jewish life was actually only the 1% of medieval elite rabbinic Jewish men's picture.
I want to zoom out for a second and ask about your process of deciding which pieces go into this book.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of text. I mean, we didn't actually, there's many. It's not like there's 4 or 5 in this book. There's dozens. But I wanted to ask, there's probably some hard decisions at play. And that also reminds me of the museum conversations. We talked about how you have to choose certain artifacts and not others, and you have to shape, in a certain sense, how people's experience will look in their situation while walking through a museum and yours while journeying through a book. So what did it look like to make some hard decisions about what to include and what not to include? Maybe, by the way, if you have an example of a text you didn't include but came close that you can give a shout out to, this could be a moment for that. And the other piece is, I guess, a broader question of what's a queer and Jewish text? What's a Jewish queer text? What defines the set of texts that you have together? Is there even any one thing that all the texts together share?
I basically thought of it as a kind of a Venn diagram of all of the myriad, complex, overlapping varieties of queer LGBTQ experience, which basically meant anything that had to do with moving between genders, defying gender categories, or pursuing relationships with someone of the same sex or gender. And then Venn diagram circle 2 is everything that's connected to the myriad of diverse and complicated ways of being Jewish, which includes texts written by Jews, texts written about Jews, and then whatever sat in the overlap of those 2 circles, that to me felt like a text that I would at least consider for inclusion in the book. So some of the texts are affirming or speaking to a queer experience written by a Jewish voice. Some of the texts are written by a Jewish author that speak against a particular vision of queer experience, but that are nonetheless, I think, important. And some of the texts are written about Jews who lived some kind of trans or queer or relevant experience. So you have newspaper reports, you have legal records, and even some literary material written by non-Jews that speaks about queer Jews or trans Jews that I thought was important to include. And those kinds of texts, by the way, are often not included in projects of Jewish history. We often look only to texts written in Jewish languages, never mind texts written by Jews not in Jewish languages. And then what do you do with texts written about Jews, that often proved to be very valuable sources in uncovering these very deep Jewish stories that until now have only been discussed in other contexts. The other important, the overarching framework that I used, once I had selected all of the material that I thought was possibly relevant to include, I had about, let's say I had probably somewhere, I haven't actually counted, but somewhere around, let's say 200 to 250 possible sources for inclusion. And I wanted 120. That was the number that I picked. It's a number that in Judaism is traditionally used to define the ideal lifetime, that someone should live 120 years. So I thought that would be a nice number, a sort of round number, as it were. So I picked 120 sources. So I thought, how did I make the hard decisions? The first thing that I looked for was a diversity of voices represented. So I wanted to make sure that the anthology represented as broad as possible spectrum of different kinds of sources, different languages, different genres, different perspectives. For example, I had a lot of material of American Jewish writers of Ashkenazi background who wrote about homosexuality like in the 1950s and 60s, men. I chose, the 3 or 4 examples that seemed to me the most interesting, evocative, or lesser known. And the others I chose not to include, both because I wanted to make space for other kinds of voices and because many of them are already well known. So for example, I didn't include Allen Ginsberg, who is a fairly well-known American Jewish poet, gay poet of the 1950s, beat poet. Lots of people have heard of Allen Ginsberg. If not, you can easily look him up on the internet. And I didn't feel like his voice brought anything particularly new to the conversation that was already lacking in the book. What I did instead was look at the material and think, whose voices are traditionally not represented? Whose voices am I missing that I could then seek out? And I did this not just at the end. I did this actually throughout the process. As I was compiling the sources, I actually mapped them. I like physically put pins in a map to see where the sources were coming from. And then I looked at the map and I thought, all right, what areas of the Jewish world are still missing? So I thought, wow, I have 17 sources from Germany, and I don't have any sources from anywhere in North Africa. That's a big problem. Where can I go to look for sources from those places? Wow, I have 57 sources from the 20th century and 30 sources from the 19th century, and I have 0 sources from the 16th century. That's a problem. How can I address that? So then I then shifted my research process and went out looking for sources to fill those gaps in different places. And that meant a lot of reading. So that was a real learning for me. So I then went out and not only read those books, but often ended up consulting with scholars. So that's how I gathered a lot of the material. And then when it came time to make the choices, I really asked myself of each source, sort of like I know we're all in this Marie Kondo moment of decluttering, so I picked up each source, as it were, and I said to myself, does this spark joy? Does this source spark some kind of new question? Is it interesting? Is it exciting? And if not, then I thought, I'll let it go. So in short, you might say I was harshest on the gay, male, Ashkenazi or white experience. A text from that perspective had to be really good, really spicy to make it into the anthology. The other texts, if it raised a perspective that has traditionally been marginalized, I felt like that was important enough to merit its inclusion, even if the content itself was not particularly. So I'll give you an example. I was really looking for sources on lesbianism in the Sephardi world, because I had some great sources about Jewish lesbians in Europe, about Jewish lesbians in America, but I really wanted, like, what about Jewish lesbians outside of those places? So I emailed around, and one scholar said to me, oh, when I was doing some archival research, I found a newspaper article about a Jewish lesbian living in Salonika, which today is in Greece, but in those days it was in the Ottoman Empire. It's a short newspaper article that describes the arrest of a Jewish woman in Salonika for having practiced sapphic love, quote unquote, that's the expression they use, with another woman. That's it. So on the surface, you might think, well, this isn't a very rich source. This is like a good beginning lead to do more archival research. But I thought it was so rare to find the name and experience of a Sephardi Jewish lesbian. I thought that was rare enough to merit its inclusion, and maybe someone will be able to dig up more material and enrich the story. As it stands, there's not much to say about it other than the fact that this woman existed, she was arrested. What happened to her, I don't know. But as it is, I thought, this really helps challenge our assumptions of invisibility and of silence, just by putting this one exception in. Again, going back to something I think we said at the very beginning of the interview, the fact that we have this one story that survives has to make us ask ourselves how many other similar stories didn't survive. How many other similar stories were not recorded? If there's anything that this book proves, I don't really like the idea that it proves anything, but if there's one thing that this book proves, it's that arguments from silence, like the argument of Rabbi Freehoff, that there are no sources that document queer Jewish life, and therefore it doesn't exist. Arguments from silence don't work anymore. Now we need to think more deeply and more creatively about what the Jewish past has been, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So I hope this book is really just opening the conversation.
Well, for just an opening, it's a pretty fantastic opening. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for joining us on the show. And we can't wait to be thinking about it and talking about it more in the future.
Thank you so much.
And thanks, of course, go out also to all of you listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we give you all of the ways to contact Dan and I, we wanted to mention once again, like we did at the top, that the way for you to get this book is not Amazon. It's not Amazon. It is through Shabbos, shabb.es. That's the site. And it's Printacraft is the publisher. And once again, the book is called A Rainbow Thread, and it's an anthology of all these incredible texts about gender and sexuality from Jewish history that we talked about today. So we hope that you'll check it out. And now for all the ways to be in touch with Dan and I, if you would like to. First, you can hit us up via Facebook at Judaism Unbound. That's our page. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply, really appreciate any amount of financial assistance that you're able to spare and send our way. And you can do that at www.judaismunbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. Before we go, we also wanted to say thank you to one of our sponsors. Support for this episode comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.